When I think about the future, two maxims come to mind. One is the understanding that, first of all, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. That's number one. And the second is something I was told by someone very wise. I don't know if any of you have been reading the biography of Steve Jobs, but it mentions that when he was very young, he made a journey to the East, and he went to seek an Indian holy man whose name was Neem Karoli Baba, and he went to his ashram. Neem Karoli had passed away by the time he got there, but I was fortunate enough to know Neem Karoli Baba, and I remember vividly what he told me about the future. He looked me square in the eye and he said, "You can plan for 100 years, but you don't know what's going to happen the next moment." So I think if we somehow walk the line between that, we already sense where it's going and yet we don't really know, we can start to talk a little bit about the future. And then there's the question of, do you focus on the upside or the downside? I have a friend who runs an organization which focuses on global threats, pandemics, nuclear threats, the global warming, water shortages, so on. Or do you focus on the upside? There's this new book by Steve Pinker, maybe some of you have seen, which looks at the history of violence throughout the whole scope of humanity's known history, and says, you know, actually, we're getting better. This is hard to believe if you read the paper or follow the news, but that if you look at the mortality rates of people who died from blunt blows to the head and so on in prehistoric times versus now, percentage-wise, we're doing much better. I don't know that we're doing much better number-wise. And then there's all of the, you know, the trends that we hear so much about, the social injustices and the gap between rich and poor, and climate change, resource scarcity, disruptive technologies. Basically, we don't know where we're going, but we have to manage it, navigate it skillfully. And that takes a certain kind of leadership. But leadership is itself really in flux. One of the big reasons is information technologies. Knowledge used to be power, but now knowledge is shared instantly, globally, and throughout organizations. So you can't, one of the big blows to that is the hierarchical leadership. You need to lead by influence, not by virtue of your authority. And secondly, it redefines who's a leader. I mean, everybody has a sphere of influence. We're all leaders. Leadership is a distributed function and will become increasingly distributive. And that puts a new valence, a new importance on a certain variety of leadership abilities. I'm going to argue that leadership in the future is going to rely on three kinds of awareness in equal parts. The first is self-awareness, the second is empathy, and the third is systems awareness. Self-awareness comes down to the fact that first we've got to lead ourselves. And that takes knowing yourself in the Socratic sense and in many other senses too. There was let me tell you about a clinical case that speaks to this. It was a brilliant corporate lawyer who unfortunately was discovered to have a prefrontal brain tumor. Luckily, the tumor was caught early, operated on successfully. But after the surgery, the lawyer couldn't do his job anymore. And it was very puzzling because he had been very high IQ, still high IQ. There was no problem in attention or memory. Not only couldn't he do his job, he lost his job. He couldn't hold any job. His marriage fell apart. He lost his house. The guy was living in his brother's spare bedroom when he went to see a famous neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio. Some of you may have read some of his books. And he goes to Damasio and he says, "Doctor, what's wrong with me?" And at first, Damasio was completely puzzled. because he's fine on all the neuropsychological tests. But then he gets a clue. He asks the lawyer, when should we have our next appointment? And he realizes the lawyer can give him the rational pros and cons for every hour for the next 2 weeks, but he doesn't know which is best. And Damasio argues that this is because during the surgery, they had created a lesion between the prefrontal area, which is the brain's executive center. This is where we lead ourselves, and the emotional center. And Damasio says, as we go through life, unconscious circuits record what works and what doesn't. It creates our life wisdom, our life experience. It collates decision rules. When I said that, that worked well. When I said that, it bombed. And so when we face a decision now, this neural circuitry shuffles based on an emotional valence what's most salient to the decision we're making. So it doesn't matter what decision we're making. It could be when to have an appointment. Should I marry this guy compared to the other people I've dated? Should I leave this job and take another? What strategy should we follow going forward? We need to listen to our life wisdom. The problem is this: the part of the brain that thinks in words has zero connectivity to the part of the brain that collects the wisdom. The part of the brain which is called the basal ganglia, which is a very primitive circuitry, that has this life experience for us, has very rich connectivity to the gut. So we get a felt sense, a gut sense. Feels right, doesn't feel right. That's information too, and it's particularly important as values information, because the answer to the question is what we're about to do in keeping with our sense of values, priority, purpose, and meaning does not come to us in words. At first it comes as this felt sense. Feels right, doesn't feel right. Then we put it into words. This is our inner rudder. So how do you attune to that? Well, there's a phrase from, I think, Emerson, the leisure to grow wise. It takes a little open space. It takes a little reflective time. And the one thing that leaders and everybody else has less and less and less of these days is free, open time. We are constantly bombarded by incomings, and it grabs our attention. So what we need is to take control of our attention. And probably, I would guess more than half of you have done some mindfulness. Mindfulness and every other meditation technique is the retraining of attention. And it's something that Asian cultures have been very good at, and something that's been underdeveloped, a very weak muscle in the West until recently. So I'm very pleased. One of the programs I love at Garrison is the contemplative education initiative, but also the entire approach, which is contemplative. It's reflective. Garrison is a place that nurtures a reflective space and gives us the luxury of gathering together with time to go deeply. And if we don't go deep in the future, I think we're cooked. The second ability that I mentioned, the second kind of awareness is empathy, tuning into other people. There's a famous Harvard Business Review article called, "Who Would Want to Be Led by You?" It's a kind of sobering question for a leader to ponder. Some time ago, there was a classic study done in social psychology. It was done at the Princeton, Divinity School at Princeton. And divinity students were told that they were going to give a practice sermon. And they were given a topic from the Bible to think about and then give the sermon, then they'd be rated. And one by one, they went over to another building to give the sermon. Half of them were given the topic of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped to help a stranger in need by the side of the road. The other half were given miscellaneous Bible topics. So as each of them is going to the other building, they pass a man who is bent over and moaning in pain. Interesting predicament. So do they stop to help? Do they even notice? Does it I think the real question is, does it matter if you're pondering the parable of the Good Samaritan? Absolutely not, it turns out. What made the difference was how much time pressure they felt they were under. This is the story of our lives. We are constantly surrounded by moments to notice pain, to help. And yet, do we take that first step? There's a spectrum that runs from full self-absorption, my day, my to-do list, my things that I have to, my emails I have to return. In other words, we're completely self-focused. We don't notice the stranger in need by the side of the road. And then there's that step of actually noticing, oh, there's someone there. And then tuning in. This is where empathy comes in. Sensing what's going on with that person. And then not only that, but if there is pain, if there is need, spontaneously doing something to help. Compassion. Compassion begins with getting out of our self-focus. The Dalai Lama puts it very well. He says, the moment you think of someone else, your mind expands. Your mind expands. There's a new science, social neuroscience, which studies the part of the brain which is actually newly discovered, which is designed to tune into the person we're with. It's called the social brain. And the first discovery in the social brain was what's called mirror neurons. Some of you may know about mirror neurons. They were discovered by a lab in Italy where they were analyzing a single neuron in a monkey that only fired when that monkey raised its arm. Didn't do anything any other time. And one day the monkey wasn't moving and the neuron was firing and they're wondering what's going on. Then they realized what was happening. It was a hot day and a lab assistant had gone out to get a gelato and he's standing there in front of the monkey's cage and every time he raises the gelato to take a lick, the monkey's neuron for the same movement fires. That's how mirror neurons operate. When we're with someone, our mirror neurons are like a radar that attunes to that person's movements, feelings, intentions, and activates inside our brain what's going on in the other person. This forms an instant brain-to-brain bridge. It's a bridge for emotions. It means there's an emotional subtext to whatever else we're doing. It'd been known in psychology for years that if two strangers come into a lab, fill out a mood checklist, how am I feeling right now, and then sit looking at each other in silence for 2 minutes, the most expressive person in that dyad passes his or her emotions to the other in 2 silent minutes. Mirror neurons. So we have the capacity to instantly know, instantly sense. The question is, do we notice? The question is, what difference does it make? For one thing, there's no rapport, there's no chemistry, there's no real connection without it. I don't know how many of you are of a certain age where you remember when a book called I and Thou was a big seller on campuses. Martin Buber. He wrote about 2 modes of relating. One is the I-it, and one is the I-you. The I-it is where you treat the other person like an object. It's tuned out. You just talk at them. You don't care how they take it in, what it means to them, so on. The I-you is a very intimate connection, so that our mirror neurons are creating a strong bridge, and not only mirror neurons, many other circuits. But it matters. We adjust what we do. I remember when I was writing about this, I was actually in this neighborhood doing some research in a sushi bar. And the research was, I was sitting next to 2 ladies who, they're right next to me. I couldn't help but overhear the conversation. One of the women is talking about her brother, who's been, she said, in the single scene for a long time and not having any luck. And she says, I know exactly why. Lately, he's so desperate, he's been going to speed dating. And I don't know if I've never seen speed dating, but apparently young ladies or eligible ladies sit at a table with a timer on it, and men go from table to table and have a time conversation, and at the end, the lady can choose to give contact information or not. And this woman says, and my brother's never gotten a single follow-up. I know exactly why. He's so nervous that the moment he sits down, he talks nonstop about himself. He's trying to impress her. It's a big turnoff. Then later that same week, I did some further research in the Styles Sunday section of the Times, where they do a backstory of a wedding. It's kind of fascinating sometimes. They did the wedding of Allison Charney Epstein. When Allison Charney was dating, she had a little rule, a little game. On a first date, she would time how long it took from the moment she got together with the gentleman to when he asked a question with the word "you" in it. And apparently Epstein aced the test because therefore the wedding. The moment we think of others, our world expands, the mind expands. In the scientific literature, empirical literature, it's not that scientific, the empirical literature on leadership, there are studies that are done by organizations, internal studies called competence modeling, where they take top 10% leaders by whatever metric of performance makes most sense and compare them with people who are only average. And one of the findings is that it's this social sense, this empathy, this ability to communicate, to listen, to persuade, that makes the difference between the most highly effective leaders and those who are simply good individual performers, if that. There's also a new literature on what's called the secure base leader. This is a compassionate leader. This is the leader who cares. This is the leader who builds the equivalent of good parenting. You know, John Bowlby, the psychoanalyst, talked about how every child needs a secure base. That's parents, caregivers who tune in, who empathize, who understand what the child needs, who listen, who respond. It creates a sense of safety, that the world is a place you can trust. That, in turn, empowers a child to explore, to take risks. And in the workplace, it's the same thing. It creates an environment, a secure-based leader creates an environment where people feel free to take risks, to innovate, to explore. And that's what we're going to need more and more and more, because the final question is, where are we going? And this has to do with that third focus, the systems focus. The competence modeling, which is really interesting, it's done, the data is actually proprietary, but I was able to get access to a couple hundred studies and aggregate them. And not only does it turn out that self-awareness and self-management, discipline, learning to improve performance and so on, and empathy and communication skills are critical to effective leaders, but so is one cognitive skill, and that cognitive skill is big picture thinking, seeing the system and understanding systems, understanding how a decision over here ramifies and has a consequence over there, how if we do this today, how it'll matter in 5 months, 5 years, 50 years, big picture thinking. The system that I've been most intrigued by and looking into is the planetary system. I wrote a book called Ecological Intelligence. Actually, I'm really chagrined that it was called Ecological Intelligence. I'm really tired of intelligence, and I promise my next book will not have the word intelligence in the title. But the problem is that we're in the Anthropocene age. And how many of you are familiar with the Anthropocene concept? The Anthropocene concept is very important. It's the current geological era. It began with the Industrial Revolution, and it's marked by the fact that the activities of single species, us, is systematically deteriorating the 8 global systems that support life on the planet. And within the last 50 years, there's been an acceleration. It's called the Great Acceleration. Every indicator, the velocity is increasing. And we're indifferent. I mean, there are those of us, certainly Garrison has a beautiful program in this, there are people who are trying to do what they can. But frankly, as an aggregate, as a collective, we're committing slow motion species suicide. And it's because of a design flaw in the human brain. The brain's threat system, which is circuits that concentrate on the amygdala, is designed for the dangers of the Pleistocene, a different era, the saber-toothed tiger, the rustle in the bushes. And our perceptual system is attuned to that range because there was real evolutionary pressure to note it, to be good in that domain. Today, the threats are too macro and too micro to be perceived by our direct perceptual apparatus. We don't sense it. Nor does our amygdala care. It shrugs. So the fact is that our systems of energy, transportation, construction, industry, and commerce are all, as byproducts, eroding our ability to sustain life on the planet. That's the great tragedy. We're poorly designed for the challenge we face. Because of that, we need a different kind of awareness again. I've become very intrigued by a new discipline. It's called industrial ecology, which looks at anything. It looks at this watch, that microphone, the glass on the table in front of you, and looks very precisely. It's an amalgam of engineering and physics and chemistry and biology, environmental science, and so on. And for example, the glass at your table, they'll look at as not a glass, it's not a product, it's a process. The process began when sand was dug up. And they break it down actually into 1,959 steps from the beginning of the glass to the end of the glass. And each of those steps can be assayed for a spectrum of emissions into air, water, soil, use of water, use of energy, carbon, toxic chemicals, you name it. And not only that, there's a precise metric. Once we have a metric, that matters because there is a saying, what gets measured gets managed. More and more companies are getting smart about this, and they're starting to use this lens to see what they're doing and how they can do things better. But here's the big dilemma. If you ask people who are shopping, for example, if you knew that glass was really bad for the planet, but this other one was really good, would you buy the better glass if the price were the same? About 10% say, yes, in fact, I'd go to another store to get the better one. 10%. 2/3 say, well, I might. A third couldn't care less. And this is the big dilemma. There is growing awareness globally of the consequences of the Anthropocene, but still too little action. A few weeks ago, I was in Dharamsala, India, with the Dalai Lama and a group of environmental scientists and some ethicists. And one of the presentations was by a woman here in the city, Elke Weber at Columbia. And she looked at the entire literature on why people don't do anything, even when it's in their best interest. And she said, essentially the problem boils down to this. If you try to motivate people through fear or anger, global warming is going to get you, kind of thing, it creates a distressing feeling, and a distressing feeling is unpleasant. So people will do maybe one thing to feel a little better and then forget about it. On the other hand, if you frame it in a positive way and you give people concrete, manageable steps that they can feel good about, they'll keep going. We need to change our strategies, essentially. I want to leave you with a notion which I think has that potential, because when we talk about the negative impacts, we're talking about our footprint, carbon footprint, water footprint, energy footprint. But there's a new concept I heard about at the same meeting, a guy named Gregory Norris. He said, he is an industrial ecologist. He said, we should start measuring our handprint. Our handprint is the sum total of all the good things we do, whether it's individually, as a family, as a neighborhood, as a community, as a business, a building, an organization. And focus on the handprint, because people can feel good about the handprint. And that means, for example, a business can look in its supply chain and find it turns out that one of the most universally beneficial greening steps that's been taken is when Caterpillar Tractor invented a hybrid tractor. Why? There are tractors in everybody's supply chain. So if anybody in that supply chain does something better, it counts, it ripples all the way through. And as companies start to get into a continuous upgrade, they can look at their handprint. And the handprint is something you can talk about in a very positive way. It's much better than saying, Walker's potato chips have this carbon footprint. In Britain, every product is labeled a carbon footprint. I think we should talk about something positive. And I also would like to leave you with this thought. Some of you know Matthew Ricard, I think. He's a remarkable fellow. He has a PhD in biology, but he also has been a monk for 25 years, done a lot of meditation. Some of the best meditation research was done in collaboration with him. And Matthew was invited by Paul Ekman, world expert on facial emotions, to participate in an experiment because Matthew's brain had been studied in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, and it turned out that when he generated compassion, the Center for Positive Emotions got super active. It happens in anyone who's done more than 10 continuous years of retreat. The good news is it starts to happen as soon as you do a little mindfulness. Anyway, he was called the happiest man in the world, I think by his publishers, PR people. Anyway, so Ekman invites the happiest man in the world to have a debate with the grumpiest man at the University of California. And he was able to establish in a telephone survey confidentially who that was. Everybody agreed. So he asked his professor if in the interest of science, he'd come and have a debate with Matthew while their physiology was recorded and so on. So the day comes, and as it draws nearer and nearer, the grumpiest professor starts making demands that become increasingly, we just can't do that. So they had to dump him and go with the second most difficult professor. And the thing that the debate was on the premise that the professor should do what Matthew had done, that is, abandon his career. He had a plum professorship and become a hermit for the rest of his life and meditate. Beginning of the debate, physiology shows the professor's very upset. Matthew's perfectly calm. As they start having the discussion, the professor gets calmer and calmer and calmer. Matthew stays calm. By the end of 15 minutes, the professor's having such a good time, he doesn't want to stop. In other words, you don't have to be a world-class meditator, but anytime we encounter anyone, anytime we have an interaction, that's a moment of leadership. That's a moment of influence, potentially. Any of us can do whatever we can to help that other person get in a better state. In other words, we can all be stealth bodhisattvas if we try. Thank you.